Okay, picture the scene. It's May 1940. The world is entirely engulfed in the Second World War. Germany has just invaded France and Belgium, and the British army, who had rushed inland to help, well, they find themselves pushed all the way back to the coast. Specifically, they're trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. And I mean completely cut off. The German armored divisions are advancing so rapidly, aiming to annihilate the British forces before any reinforcements can even think about arriving from across the channel. The British army is quite literally backed against the sea, staring down total destruction. It's one of those moments of absolute, paralyzing crisis where human strategy has just completely run out.
And this situation brilliantly illustrates how leadership can dramatically shift in moments of total desperation. The King of England at the time, George VI, takes to the BBC national radio. But here's the thing. He doesn't announce some brilliant new military tactic. He doesn't promise a secret weapon. Instead, he does something completely unexpected. He declares a national day of prayer. His message was incredibly simple, basically an admission that their cutting-edge weapons and military might were just utterly insufficient for the task at hand. He tells the entire nation that their only hope is to cry out to God. And amazingly, millions of British citizens actually flooded into churches, dropping their reliance on national power and desperately asking for an unseen hand to intervene.
So what happened next? Following that massive national plea, a staggering 330,000 troops were rescued from those beaches. This is what history remembers as the miracle of Dunkirk. And to put that into perspective, this wasn't just some minor extraction. It was the salvation of an entire army that, strategically speaking, was supposed to be completely wiped off the map. Now, the really crucial point here is how this rescue actually unfolded. On one side, you have these virtually unstoppable German tanks. But suddenly, out of nowhere, severe, completely unexpected rainstorms hit the German positions, turning the ground into this massive, unpassable mud pit. The irony here is just incredible, right? The world's most feared, technologically advanced war machine was literally stopped in its tracks by a puddle of mud. Meanwhile, on the other side, you have the English Channel, which is notoriously choppy and incredibly dangerous. Yet, during the evacuation, it became historically, almost uncharacteristically calm. It was so flat that not just big military destroyers, but tiny, fragile civilian fishing boats could safely cross over and ferry those 330,000 men home. It really proved to them that victory and rescue came from somewhere else, completely bypassing standard human military logic. All right, moving into Section 1, Secrets of the Genealogy, Finding Hope in Names. So you might be wondering, why are we talking about World War II in an explainer about ancient biblical texts? Well, the source material uses this exact Dunkirk narrative as a framing device to help us understand the seemingly confusing, endless lists of names in the ancient genealogies of First Chronicles. To really get why these names matter, we have to understand exactly who they were written for. You see, First Chronicles wasn't just some dry history textbook. It was written specifically for the Jewish people who had just returned from decades of brutal, soul-crushing exile in Babylon. They had finally come back to Jerusalem, but it was a ruined, devastated land. They basically had nothing. So these long lists of names, they weren't just trivia. They were a survival map. They were a vital way for a deeply traumatized people to rediscover their identity and find some glimmer of hope as they started over from absolute zero. And the author organizes this survival map very intentionally. The sequence starts out really broad, going from Adam to Jacob, which establishes their shared human ancestry. But then, and this is key, it doesn't just list the 12 tribes in birth order. It jumps straight to Judah. Why? Well, because the returning exiles were primarily from the tribe of Judah. That was the royal line, the line of King David. It was the absolute most relevant information for their immediate survival. Then it moves to Simeon. Geographically speaking, Simeon's land was entirely enclosed within Judah's territory. So this flow is incredibly logical once you realize the author is speaking directly to the survivors, reminding them exactly who they are and where they come from. Which brings us to Section 2, Tribes East of the Jordan. After covering Judah and Simeon, the text shifts its focus to the descendants of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Now hold on a minute. Reuben was actually Jacob's firstborn son chronologically. So why on earth wasn't he listed first? Well, the text explicitly tells us that while Reuben was indeed the firstborn, he lost that ultimate privilege because of a really grave mistake. He slept with his father's concubine. And because of that, the traditional right of the firstborn, which usually included a double portion of the inheritance, was stripped right from him and handed over to Joseph, who was the firstborn of Jacob's second wife. It's a pretty stark reminder of how their actions directly reshaped their history. But there is a second reason Reuben and Gad are grouped together here, and it's purely geographical. They didn't settle in the primary promised land west of the Jordan River. Instead, they settled east of the Jordan in an area called Gilead. Why there? Because they were traditionally shepherds. When they saw the lush, green grazing lands of Gilead and the plains of Moab, they realized it was absolutely perfect for their livestock. They asked for this specific land, and they got it. But by choosing to live outside the main borders, they were somewhat isolated, and that isolation perfectly sets the geographical stage for an impending, massive crisis. Let's dive into Section 3, the 44,000 warriors. Suddenly, right in the middle of listing all these ancient names, the text just interrupts itself to describe a battle, a massive, previously unrecorded battle that these eastern tribes faced against a group known as the Hagarites. And the author doesn't just vaguely say they had a big army. He gives us the exact, bold number of troops in this Transjordan army, 44,760 soldiers. By quantifying the exact stakes here, the text emphasizes that this wasn't a minor skirmish. This was a full-scale, devastating war for their very survival. And we need to be clear, this wasn't a weak, defenseless group of farmers holding pitchforks. The text specifically calls them men accustomed to war. They were equipped with shields, armed with swords, highly skilled with bows, and heavily trained. They had incredible military prowess. Honestly, they were the absolute elite fighting force of their day, very much like those formidable Allied forces right before they got trapped at Dunkirk. They had absolutely every reason to be confident in their own strength. But here is the major turning point of the entire text. With over 44,000 elite soldiers, heavily armed and highly trained, why did they actually win? Interestingly, the text doesn't credit their swords or their shields at all. It says they were helped because they trusted in God and cried out to Him. Their formidable weapons didn't save them. Just like at Dunkirk, their victory came solely because, in the absolute heat of battle, they relied on an unseen hand. Let's break down the actual mechanics of this miracle, because this is exactly what the author wanted those Babylonian exiles to understand. Step 1. They had to actually trust God's power over their own human weapons. Step 2. They had to cry out in desperate prayer right there on the battlefield. Just imagine that vivid picture for a second. Over 44,000 soldiers in the chaotic, deadly, deafening center of a battlefield with swords clashing and arrows flying everywhere, literally choosing to cry out to God. And Step 3. Because of that reliance, they received God's miraculous rescue. The author is telling the returning exiles, who are trying to rebuild a broken city with no army and no money whatsoever, that their success isn't going to come from military might or wealth, but from crying out for help. Finally, we've reached Section 4, our spiritual battle. The source material connects these ancient historical accounts directly to our modern-day struggles. Look, we might not be facing German tanks or ancient Hagarite armies today, but we absolutely face modern battlefronts. We face terrifying health crises, crushing financial pressure, or deeply strained relationships. And the text suggests our modern instinct is to rely on our own swords and shields. We trust in our personal wealth. We trust in our human knowledge. We tend to think that if we just work a little harder, read one more book, or save just a little more money, we can win the war entirely on our own. We act exactly like those 44,000 soldiers, relying on their bows, completely forgetting that it wasn't the bow that actually saved them. So the ultimate question this text leaves its readers with is this: what is the giant enemy you are facing right now? What is backing you against a sea? Just like the British Army at Dunkirk, and just like the ancient tribes of Reuben and Gad, the source suggests there comes a crucial moment where our human tools are simply not enough. It challenges us to consider if true rescue actually begins the very moment we stop relying solely on our own strength and finally ask for help. It's a truly powerful thought to reflect on as you navigate whatever challenges you're facing in the week ahead.